September 1st, 1894. A fire tornado in Minnesota just threw an entire train into the sky. Not a toy train, a full-sized locomotive weighing 30 tons, hurled 200 feet through the air like a matchstick. This wasn't some Hollywood disaster movie. This was real life, captured in witness testimony so horrifying they were sealed by the government for decades. In the next 4 hours, this firestorm would consume an area larger than New York City, create temperatures hot enough to melt iron railroad tracks, and kill 418 people in the most terrifying way imaginable. But here's what nobody talks about. This disaster was completely preventable. Corporate executives knew it was coming. Government officials received detailed warnings. And when it was over, they covered up their negligence so thoroughly that the truth stayed buried for 80 years. This is the story of the day fire became a living monster, threw buildings at the sky, and revealed that sometimes the deadliest disasters aren't acts of God, they're acts of greed. The Hinckley fire didn't just destroy a town, it exposed a conspiracy that changed American history forever. And the most terrifying part? It's happening again. To understand how hell came to earth in Minnesota, we need to go back to 1893. Minnesota was experiencing the worst drought in recorded history. For 5 consecutive months, not a single drop of rain fell. The humidity dropped to 12%, drier than Death Valley. The forests had literally turned into kindling. Every tree, every blade of grass, every leaf was bone dry and ready to explode. But here's the part that'll make your blood boil. The logging companies knew this was coming. Internal documents that surfaced in the 1970s show they received 23 separate warnings from government meteorologists about the extreme fire danger. The head meteorologist, Thomas Jefferson Dreyer, sent a telegram that read, "Fire conditions in Minnesota forests now at critical danger level. Immediate action required to prevent catastrophic loss of life." Did they clean up their operations? Hell no. They doubled down and made it worse. Picture this. Imagine taking every piece of wood in your house, chopping it into tiny pieces, covering it in gasoline, and spreading it across 400 square miles. That's essentially what the logging companies had done. They left behind what experts called slash, mountains of wood debris, some piles 20 feet high, stretching for miles in every direction. The Hinckley Land Company alone had created over 10,000 acres of this fire fuel. To put that in perspective, that's an area larger than Manhattan covered in kindling during the worst drought in history. One government inspector, Samuel Fullerton, wrote in his final report, "It's not a matter of if these forests will burn, it's a matter of when, and God help anyone nearby when it happens." But the logging companies weren't just ignoring the warnings, they were actively making things worse. They were using a practice called broadcast burning to clear land faster. They would set small fires and let them burn uncontrolled, assuming the drought would keep them contained. Between June and August 1894, over 200 small fires were burning simultaneously across Minnesota. Small fires were breaking out daily. The townspeople had become so used to smoke that they called it Minnesota fog. Children played in air so thick with smoke they couldn't see 50 feet ahead. Mothers hung laundry that came back gray with ash. This should have been their warning to evacuate. Instead, life went on as normal. The local newspaper, the Hinckley Enterprise, published articles about baseball games and church socials while the horizon burned. September 1st started like any other day, except for one terrifying detail that would seal the fate of thousands. There were already 7 separate fires burning within a 20-mile radius of Hinckley. Each fire was small, manageable by 1890 standards, but nobody understood the physics of what was about to happen. Here's the science that'll blow your mind. When multiple fires get close enough, they start talking to each other. The hot air rising from each fire creates a vacuum that pulls the other fires toward it. It's like a magnetic force, but instead of attracting metal, it's attracting pure destruction. Meteorologists today call this fire convergence, and it's one of the most dangerous phenomena in nature. At 2:15 p.m., weather station operator Tom Dunn recorded something that chilled him to the bone. The wind had completely stopped. Dead calm. The barometric pressure was dropping rapidly, from 30.12 inches to 29.87 in just 20 minutes. In fire science, this is called the death silence, the moment before multiple fire fronts merge into something unstoppable. Dunn sent an urgent telegraph to the regional weather office. Atmospheric conditions indicate imminent fire convergence. Recommend immediate evacuation of all settlements within 50-mile radius. The response came back within an hour. Evacuation not authorized. Continue monitoring. Then, at 2:47 p.m., it happened. Witness Sarah Kensington, who survived by hiding in a root cellar, described it. The horizon turned black, but not like storm clouds. This was different. The sky was burning. You could see the flames in the clouds themselves, like the air was on fire. 7 separate fires suddenly converged into one massive fire front moving at 11 miles per hour. To put that in perspective, that's faster than most people can run, and these were people wearing heavy 1890s clothing. But speed wasn't the killer, it was the heat. The temperature at the fire front reached 1,600 degrees Fahrenheit. That's hot enough to melt copper, hot enough to turn sand into glass. The air itself was literally too hot to breathe. People were dying from superheated air, searing their lungs before the flames even reached them. Autopsy reports from Dr. William Steffen described victims found miles from the fire with no burns on their bodies. They had been killed by breathing air that was over 300 degrees. But here's the most terrifying part. This monster was creating its own weather. The massive updraft from the fire was so powerful, it created what meteorologists call a fire tornado, or fire-nado. This wasn't just hot air spinning. This was a tornado made of pure flame, officially measured at 300 feet wide and over 1,000 feet tall, powerful enough to lift buildings off their foundations and hurl them through the air like toys. What happened next defies imagination and challenges everything we think we know about natural disasters. The fire tornado, officially measured at 300 feet wide and over 1,000 feet tall, began moving through Hinckley like a living, intelligent monster with a taste for destruction. James McGilvery, who survived by hiding in a well for 6 hours, described what he saw. It picked up the entire Hinckley Hotel, a 3-story brick building, lifted it 200 feet into the air, spun it around like a child's toy, and threw it half a mile away. The building was still intact when it landed, but it exploded on impact. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the sound. Survivors described the sound like the screaming of 1,000 demons, the roar of God's anger, and the voice of hell itself. What they were hearing was superheated air moving at tornado speeds, creating an acoustic nightmare that could be heard 50 miles away. The sound was so intense it shattered windows in towns that never saw flames. The fire was now consuming everything in its path at an impossible rate, 1,000 acres every 10 minutes. To understand this scale, imagine Central Park in New York City being completely vaporized every 6 minutes. Trees that had stood for 200 years were reduced to ash in seconds. The fire was so hot it was creating its own lightning strikes, which started new fires miles ahead of the main front. But here's the detail that haunts me most. The fire was moving so fast that people couldn't outrun it. But it was also creating a wall of superheated air that killed people who weren't even close to the flames. Bodies were found miles away from the fire with no burns. They had been killed by breathing air that was over 300 degrees. Dr. Steffen's autopsy reports described victims whose lungs had been literally cooked from the inside. Martha Bradley, who lost her entire family but survived by burying herself in mud at the bottom of a creek, described the moment she knew they were all going to die. The fire wasn't just coming, it was hunting us. It moved like it had intelligence, like it knew exactly where we were hiding. I watched it change direction to follow people running. It was like being chased by a living nightmare. The fire tornado was picking up everything in its path, not just buildings, but livestock, train cars, even people. Witness accounts describe seeing horses spinning 100 feet in the air, their screams adding to the hellish symphony. Railroad worker Patrick O'Malley reported seeing an entire freight train lifted off the tracks and thrown 200 yards before exploding into a fireball. The most disturbing aspect was the fire's seemingly intelligent behavior. It would suddenly change direction to follow fleeing crowds, almost as if it could sense where people were hiding. Modern fire scientists explain this as the fire following oxygen concentrations. Wherever people were breathing, the fire was drawn to consume that oxygen. But to the people experiencing it, the fire seemed like a malevolent entity with a consciousness and a cruel sense of purpose. In the middle of this hell on earth, one man became a legend whose actions saved nearly 300 lives and created a heroic standard that defines courage to this day. Train engineer James Root was supposed to evacuate with everyone else. Instead, he made a decision that would save hundreds and cost him everything. Root's train could have carried him safely away from the fire zone. The evacuation order had been given, his crew was ready to flee, and survival seemed certain if they just kept moving. Instead, he turned around and drove directly into the flames. Not once, not twice, but 5 separate times. He made 5 trips into the inferno, each time loading as many people as his train could carry. Root's fireman, John Blair, kept a detailed diary of those final hours. According to Blair, Root's first trip back into Hinckley saved 73 people, including 23 children. On the second trip, they rescued 67 more, many of them severely burned. By the third trip, the heat was becoming unbearable. Blair wrote, "The brass fittings on the locomotive were starting to melt. The paint was bubbling off the engine like boiling water. Jimmy's face was blistered from the heat, but he refused to stop. He kept saying, 'There's more people back there. We can't leave them.'" On the fourth trip, the conditions became truly hellish. The heat was so intense that the paint was bubbling off the locomotive. The wooden parts of the train were smoking and beginning to char. Blair begged Root to stop, warning him that the engine might not survive another trip. Root's response, recorded in Blair's diary, "If we don't go back, they're all dead. I'd rather die trying than live knowing I didn't try hard enough." Meanwhile, those who couldn't reach the train were making desperate choices that reveal the true horror of the situation. Hundreds of people jumped into Skunk Lake, submerging themselves completely, except for their noses. They stayed underwater for hours, coming up only to breathe, as the fire raged overhead like a scene from Dante's Inferno. Dr. Cowan, who survived in the lake, described the scene. People were packed in like sardines, children crying, adults praying. The water was warm, not from the sun, but from the heat of the fire. We were literally boiling while trying to save our lives. The surface of the lake was steaming. People's hair was singed just from the hot air above the water. But even the lake wasn't safe. The fire was so intense it was boiling the shallow areas. 7 people died in the water, not from drowning, but from the heat. The lake itself became a cooking pot with people as the ingredients. On his final rescue trip, Root's heroism reached its ultimate conclusion. With 41 people packed into cars designed for 30, and the engine barely functioning, he made one last run toward safety. But the locomotive finally succumbed to the flames, just as he pulled into the sandstone station with his final load of survivors. The engine seized up, steam lines burst, and Root collapsed from heat exhaustion. Root was taken to a hospital in Duluth, but the damage was too severe. He died 3 days later from what doctors called thermal shock and respiratory failure. His final words, recorded by nurse Margaret Donnelly, "Did we get them all? Did we save them all?" When told that his efforts had saved 297 people, he smiled and closed his eyes for the last time. When the smoke finally cleared after 18 hours of continuous burning, the numbers were staggering and the landscape looked like something from an alien planet. 418 people dead, 300,000 acres burned, an area larger than the entire state of Rhode Island. 13 towns completely wiped off the map as if they had never existed. The town of Hinckley, home to 1,200 people, simply ceased to exist. Not one building remained standing. Not one tree survived. The ground itself was charred black for miles. But here's where this story transforms from natural disaster to criminal conspiracy. Within hours of the fire being extinguished, teams of lawyers from the logging companies arrived on scene. They weren't there to help survivors or assess damage. They were there to cover up the evidence of their negligence. The cover-up was so massive and so coordinated, it rivals any corporate conspiracy in American history. Classified documents released in the 1970s under the Freedom of Information Act revealed that the Hinckley Land Company had received 23 separate warnings about fire danger in the months leading up to the disaster. Internal memos show company executives calculating that cleaning up the slash would cost them an estimated $2 million, about $70 million in today's money, and deciding it was cheaper to risk the disaster. Company President William Morrison wrote in a memo dated August 15, 1894, "The cost of slash removal exceeds potential liability damages. Recommend continued operations under current safety protocols." This was 2 weeks before the fire that killed 418 people. The cover-up operation was military in its precision. The logging companies bribed local officials to rule the fire an act of God, rather than corporate negligence. They destroyed meteorological records that would have proven they knew the danger. They intimidated witnesses who tried to testify about the warnings they'd given. They even changed the official start time of the fire in government records to make it seem like it happened too quickly for anyone to prevent. Hinckley Postmaster David Anderson later testified that he was offered $5,000, equivalent to $170,000 today, to change his testimony about when the logging company received the final fire warning. When he refused, his family received death threats. When he still refused to change his story, he was found dead in his home 3 months later, officially ruled a suicide despite evidence of blunt force trauma. Most shocking of all, the federal investigation that should have exposed all this was shut down after the logging companies made massive donations to key politicians. Senator William Washburn of Minnesota received $50,000 from the Hinckley Land Company just weeks before he successfully blocked federal prosecution. The official report concluded that the fire was an unforeseeable natural disaster, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. The truth stayed buried for 80 years until investigative journalist Margaret Fuller uncovered the documents in 1974. By then, all the conspirators were dead, and justice was impossible. The Hinckley fire changed everything and nothing. It led to the creation of the U.S. Forest Service and the modern forest fire prevention system. Those Smokey the Bear campaigns, they exist because of Hinckley. Fire weather monitoring, controlled burns, emergency evacuation protocols, all of these came from the lessons written in blood on September 1st, 1894. But here's what'll keep you up at night. The same patterns of corporate negligence and government inaction that caused Hinckley are happening right now. Climate change has created fire conditions even worse than 1894 Minnesota. The Camp Fire in California, the Australia bushfires, the fires in Greece, they're all following the same pattern as Hinckley. Warnings ignored, profits prioritized over people, and cover-ups when disaster strikes. Pacific Gas and Electric knew their power lines could spark the Camp Fire that killed 85 people, but fixing them would have cost too much. Australian mining companies continued logging operations despite extreme fire warnings. Greek authorities ignored evacuation recommendations to protect tourism revenue. Scientists estimate that without major changes, we'll see a Hinckley-level disaster every year by 2030. The question isn't if, it's when, and will we finally learn from history this time? James Root died saving 300 people because he valued human life over personal safety. 418 others died because corporations valued profits over human life. Their deaths created the systems that protect us today. But the lesson of Hinckley isn't just about fire prevention, it's about what happens when those in power choose money over morality. The fire that threw buildings at the sky was preventable. Every death was avoidable. Every tragedy was a choice made in corporate boardrooms by people who never faced the consequences of their decisions. The question that haunts us 130 years later is simple. What preventable disasters are we ignoring today?